Okay, for this for this lesson, we are continuing our work. I've got to get to the beginning here. We're continuing our work in Chapter 6 on fallacies. And specifically, we're not dealing just with fallacies of induction anymore. So the last chapter covered what we called fallacies of induction, which is fallacies that are common to induction reasoning. In this chapter, we're working on a different kind of fallacy, and we're calling these fallacies relevance fallacies. So here's what you need to know. And I've got this interesting little thing here. Relevance fallacies are very oftentimes referred to as red herrings, and you may have heard that phrase, that term used before, a red herring. Let me tell you a little bit about how the red herring fallacy got its name. It comes from the practice of training fox hunting dogs in, I believe, what was England, or what is England, back in the day, and perhaps this method is still used, I don't quite know. But when they're attempting to teach the fox hunting dogs, like Jack Russells and other hound dogs, to chase foxes, they want the dog to zero in on the scent of the fox and the scent of the fox only. So typically what they would do is that they would take something with the fox's scent on it, perhaps the pelt of a fox, and they would run it through the woods, and they would create a scent trail. And in order to teach the dog to discern the scent trail of the fox and to only follow the scent trail of the fox, across the fox's scent trail, they would drag a bag of dead red herring. And red herring is a fish, and it's a very pungent fish, as I understand it. And that smell is very intriguing to the dogs. And so the well-trained dogs would not be distracted by the red herrings. The less well-trained dogs would be distracted by the red herrings. They would pursue the scent of the red herring rather than staying focused on the scent of the fox. Red herring fallacies have about the same structure to them, in the sense that red herring fallacies really bring in an irrelevancy to distract you from what's really going on or what's really at issue. So this is how they got their name, red herring. Let's go back again and talk about what a fallacy is real quick. A fallacy is a mistake in reasoning. We might more specifically call it an argument that doesn't support or prove what it's supposed to support or prove. That is typically because of a mistake in reasoning. The problem with fallacies is that while they don't logically prove or support their conclusion, they still will oftentimes seem very convincing, and as a result, people are often persuaded by them. Not, again, because of the logic of what's said, but just because it strikes them as a good point or is in other ways convincing. So we're going to focus first on what we call fallacies of relevance. And so, again, the red herring is what we mean by that. And a red herring is, again, just a distraction, like the red herring fish dragged across the trail, the scent trail of the fox. The red herring is a distraction. It's something that's irrelevant that's brought in purportedly to support a conclusion, though it doesn't. It is irrelevant to supporting, proving, or disproving that conclusion. So when we make an argument or give reasons that are not really relevant to a conclusion, we commit what we call a red herring fallacy, right? So here's a quick example. You tell me it's dangerous to text when I'm driving, but I have seen you doing it too. The old, ha ha ha, you're a hypocrite line, essentially, right? notice that whether you have texted while you drive is irrelevant to the issue of whether or not it's dangerous to text when you drive. So we might say, of course it's dangerous to, and it's dangerous even if I'm doing it. Yes, I might be a hypocrite. I might be doing what I'm saying shouldn't be done, but that doesn't mean that I'm wrong. Okay? Now, notice the underlying tone here in this one. It's basically, you're a hypocrite. This is a kind of red herring fallacy. They don't all have this undertone of hypocrisy. Only a certain kind of red herring has this sort of undertone of hypocrisy. And those we call ad hominem fallacies. Ad hominem. Okay? So an ad hominem fallacy is a fallacy we commit when, rather than talking about what's at issue, we dismiss someone's position by discussing the person rather than their argument or their position. So here's the trick about ad hominem versions of the red herring fallacy. By the way, we call it an argumentum ad hominem, which again sounds like a Harry Potter curse. Nonetheless, when we commit an ad hominem form of the red herring fallacy, we are bringing an irrelevancy in. That's what makes it red herring. The ad hominem version, it's important to understand the distinction between the argument and the arguer. The argument, or the idea, is what the person is saying. It's the substance of their ideas. That is separate from the person giving the argument. So it might well be the case that there's a complete hypocrite giving the argument. Donald Trump might talk about the importance of paying your federal income taxes, and we might well call him a hypocrite for that. Hillary Clinton might well talk about the need for a strong national security, and she would very much sound like a hypocrite on that point, given her private email servers and these sorts of things. But to take issue with the arguer is not to take issue with the argument, and it is a distraction. It's a red herring. It's a focus on the arguer, not the argument. Hillary Clinton is correct. We do need a strong national security, and Donald Trump is correct. We do need to pay our federal income taxes. If they are hypocritical on these points, that's a separate issue. Their hypocrisy is separate from the truth of what they're saying. Another way I illustrate this is I was involved with a church for several years where the head pastor had spent, I remember at one point had spent several months talking about the ills of adultery. And it came up later that in fact they had been having an affair. They were not incorrect. The points that they made about adultery were not incorrect. They were just a hypocrite. So this hypocrisy undertone of the argumentum ad hominem, is how you will recognize it, but I also want you to recognize that when it comes to the points someone makes, you have to separate the message from the messenger, or the argument from the argument giver. Those are separate things. So an ad hominem argument is probably the most common fallacy on earth. As I record this lesson, we are in the middle of a political campaign year. Donald Trump is running for president against Hillary Clinton, and there are a lot of attacks that run back and forth. And the easiest way to make a point against your opponent is not to take issue with their policy, not to argue with them, but to attack them personally, ad hominem. Here's an example. According to Al Gore, global warming is the most serious threat facing us today. Now that's the idea. That's what Al Gore is asserting. notice that this person is rejecting the idea. So they say, folks, what a crock. Okay, so clearly we're rejecting Al Gore's thesis, Al Gore's claim that global warming is the most serious threat facing us today. Now the question is, okay, well, on what basis are they rejecting that? Do they have some evidence? Do they have some scientific data that will support that it's not? Or is there some other more looming threat that we should be aware of, that we need to be concerned about? What's going on here? No, it turns out that Al Gore spends $20,000 each year on electricity in his Tennessee mansion. Folks, this is actually true. This can be fact-checked. It is true that at one point, at least, he was spending that much on electricity in his Tennessee mansion. And we might well, hearing that, think of Al Gore as a hypocrite. You can't preach against carbon footprint and then use that much electricity in one house. $20,000 a year on electricity is a lot to spend, especially when you don't bother to put up solar panels, things like this, right? So we might well think he's a hypocrite. But let's assume the very worst here. Let's assume that Al Gore is a hypocrite and that he's spending $20,000 a year on electricity. That doesn't mean that he's wrong that global warming is the most serious threat facing us today. It might well be. He just might well also be a hypocrite. That is an example of the argumentum ad hominem, that is making Al Gore the issue, not the issue. Okay? Now, some will object at this point and say that they don't quite see the fallacy, so I want to look at it logically. Here's the premise. Al Gore spends $20,000 a year on electricity, and then here's their conclusion. So global warming is not the most serious threat facing us today. Now, notice that if that premise is true, it is irrelevant to that conclusion. It doesn't have anything to do with it. In case you still don't see it, here's the issue. Is global warming the most serious threat? Now, you tell me which of the following here is relevant to that, okay? Is the fact that, or the purported fact that global warming will cause rising sea levels to swamp all East Coast cities by 2100? If that's true, is that relevant to global warming being the most serious threat facing us? Yeah, that's relevant. It's absolutely relevant. Whether it's true or not, let's put that aside for a second. If that's true, it's at least relevant. It would have a bearing. It would support the conclusion, right? Remember, when we test for the validity of an argument, it's not whether the premises are true, it's whether they would be, whether if they were true, they would imply the conclusion. Well, the same thing applies here. If this is true, is it relevant to the conclusion? Well, yes, absolutely. What about this next one? Global warming will cause coral reefs to die within 30 years. Does that indicate, is that evidence that there's a serious threat here? Absolutely. Certainly there is. That is relevant. CO2 levels have risen over 30% in the last 25 years due to global warming. If that's true, is that relevant to establishing that global warming is the most serious threat facing us today? Answer, absolutely. Yes, it is. Next one. According to a study published in Nature, couldn't quite read that. According to a study published in Nature, current rates of global warming will lead to extinction for 1 million species by 2050. Is that relevant to whether global warming is a serious threat? Absolutely. That Al Gore spends $20,000 a year on electricity is irrelevant, has nothing to do with it. All right, so having established that, then let's take a look at some varieties of ad hominem argument. The first kind is the abusive ad hominem. That's when I make ad hominem means to the person or to the hominid or to the hominem. Ad means to and hominem means person, so to the person. An abusive ad hominem is when I just plain call someone a jerk or directly abuse them. What Al Gore says about air pollution is a joke. Okay, why should I think that? That clown will say anything to get attention. Notice that the speaker is simply bad-mouthing Al Gore, okay? They're just simply attacking him. This used to be called the attack ad hominem. I think now we just call it the abusive ad hominem because you're not clearly attacking him, but you are abusing him. So the abusive ad hominem just basically goes at Al Gore directly. It attacks him, essentially, in a verbal way, okay? But you're abusive towards him, okay? A second type of ad hominem is called a circumstantial ad hominem. And that's when we use a person's circumstances against them. For example, let's use Al Gore again. What Al Gore says about air pollution is pure bull. Okay, so we're rejecting what Al Gore says. Now, why should I reject that? Because Al Gore makes a fortune from alternative energy investments. So what do you think he'd say? You can hear the sarcasm in my tone there. That was awesome. Look, Al Gore might well make a lot of money from alternative energy investments, but that doesn't mean that he's wrong. That's a part of his circumstances. That doesn't mean that he's wrong about it posing a serious threat. In fact, maybe he knows, because he believes that it's the most serious threat, he's smart enough to invest in those areas, knowing that eventually we need to get there. I don't know, right? We got to be careful here. The next one is the inconsistency ad hominem. Here's the main idea behind the inconsistency ad hominem. You are allowed to change your mind. You are allowed to hold one view and then later change your mind. So let's look at the inconsistency ad hominem. Senator Clinton says we should get out of Iraq. What a bunch of garbage coming from her. She voted for the war, don't forget. Well, that she voted for the war doesn't mean that at that point she wouldn't think that we should get out. We might believe that the war is doable, except in certain circumstances, thinking those circumstances aren't likely. We get involved in the war, those unlikely circumstances come to fruition. Now we think we should get out. That doesn't mean that she's wrong that we should get out of Iraq, that she voted for it before, okay? And what we're doing is, in the inconsistency ad hominem, we're saying she's being inconsistent. She said one thing, now she's saying another. But again, we're allowed to change our minds. Okay, there are three more kinds of ad hominem arguments we're going to talk about. Again, these are all fallacies of relevance, which are red herrings. The distraction here is that we focus on the person rather than on the issue. The three more types of ad hominems. The first one is called poisoning the well. The second one is called guilt by association, and the final is called the genetic fallacy. Let's take a look at each in turn. Poisoning the well is when we try to dismiss what someone is going to say by talking about their character or their circumstances or consistency. Now, the easiest way to think about and to identify a poisoning the well fallacy is when, notice in the other fallacies there was some specific claim that I was replying to or that I was rebutting if I gave the ad hominem, right? So Al Gore says this, what a crock, he'll say anything to get elected. When I give that, there's a specific idea that I'm rejecting, that I'm saying is not true, and my reason for rejecting that specific idea is something to do with Al Gore. Poisoning the well happens more as a preemptive attack of a person. They haven't made any points yet, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it so that no matter what comes out of them, you won't trust it. It doesn't matter what it is. Think of poisoning the well in a literal form. Let's assume that we lived in a very small town and the drinking water that we had came from a well. And one day I went to the well and I took 5 gallons of gasoline and I poured it down that well. Would you trust anything that came out of that well? The answer is clearly no. Why not? Well, because I've poisoned it, right? I mean, to speak the obvious here, I've poisoned that well. And so you're not going to trust anything that comes out of it. Well, we can do the same thing when it comes to people. So here's a good example. Secretary Clinton is going to give a talk tonight on ISIS. Well, it's going to be more baloney. That girl will say anything to get a vote. Now notice, I haven't refuted any specific claim she made. I just said she's going to give a talk on ISIS. And I've set it up by telling you that she'll say anything to get a vote. I've set it up so that no matter what she says, you're skeptical. Or you might be skeptical. Or that's my intention anyways. is to have you dismiss anything she says in that because you're skeptical of her now. I've poisoned the well. She's the kind of person who will say anything to get elected. So there you go. So that's the fallacy of poisoning the well. The next one is guilt by association. Okay. In this one, there's an idea, and I get you to either probably reject the idea by likening your rejection to some other unsavory character or thing. Here's an example. You think waterboarding is torture? That sounds like something a left-wing college professor would say. Now, what have I done here, right? Well, I'm supposed to get you to reject the idea that waterboarding is torture. You're supposed to accept that waterboarding is not torture, that those who say waterboarding is torture are wrong, okay? Now, why? Well, because the other people who say that are these left-wing college professors, and God knows you wouldn't want to be one of those. And so you're going to reject the idea, or I'm trying to get you to reject the idea because you don't want to be associated with those left-wing college professors. So in this case, listeners are supposed to think calling waterboarding torture is guilty by virtue of its alleged association with supposedly left-wing college professors. Okay? All right, next let's handle the genetic fallacy. The genetic fallacy is rejecting an idea because of its source or where it came from. Genetic fallacy refers to Genesis. Most of you would be familiar with the book of Genesis in the Bible, which is the book of beginnings, sources or origins. The genetic fallacy is just a fallacy that's committed when we discredit an idea because of where it came from. We can't actually discredit ideas because of where they come from. There are very good ideas that can come from very bad sources. Okay? The source of the idea is irrelevant to the substance of the idea. My 5-year-old could believe that there's life on Mars. Let's say that I reject the idea that there's life on Mars. His accepting the idea that there's life on Mars, I could say, oh, you're totally wrong. That idea comes from this 5-year-old Ethan. He didn't know anything, right? And I'm going after the source. He's only a kid. He didn't know what he's talking about. Well, he may not know what he's talking about, but that doesn't mean that he's wrong. He could still be right. He could have a totally lucky guess, and I could be totally wrong. In other words, the source of the idea is not a reason to think that it's false. That's the genetic fallacy. So a fallacy that occurs when someone argues that the origin of a contention in and of itself automatically renders it false, which is what I did with my son. So, for example, does God exist? Of course not. This person is rejecting the idea that God exists. Now, why? Well, here's their claim. That idea originated with a bunch of ignorant people who knew nothing about science. Well, perhaps it did. I don't know that I necessarily want to call them ignorant. They certainly didn't know a whole lot about science. People have believed in God for a very long time, and they knew science, but not as we know it now. And I would argue probably didn't have the breadth of knowledge that we have now, though I imagine that 200 years from now, people will be saying much the same about us. Nonetheless, it's true that these idea came from people who didn't know a whole lot about science. That doesn't mean that they're wrong. It very well could be true. If the idea that God exists is to be rejected, it's certainly not because of where the idea originated. This is the point here. If God's existence is to be rejected, the reason to reject it is not because of where the idea came from. These folks could have very well gotten it right. Maybe for the wrong reasons, but they could have very well gotten it right. So, we don't know. All right. So compare this, by the way, the genetic fallacy to the circumstantial ad hominem. Does God exist? Of course not. The idea originated with a bunch of ignorant people who knew nothing about science. And then the circumstantial ad hominem that talks about a person's circumstances, not the origin of the idea, but the person making the argument circumstances. When we say, John says God exists, what nonsense, he's just saying that because he works for a church. The second is a circumstantial ad hominem because they're not pointing out just that John is the source and John's a moron. They're pointing out that John is the source and there's something about his circumstances, that he works in a church. So sometimes the genetic fallacy and the circumstantial ad hominem can look very much alike, but they are different in that one focuses on origins where others focus on so I say this, but circumstances, things that are not John, but John's situation. Okay? All right, there's a nice 25-minute lesson for you, and that should cover Chapter 6, Lesson 1.